All right, so we're going to talk about photography and fill in the timeline. Like I said, if you look at the timeline, there's 4 artworks that have like a title and identifiers. So those are our 4 required images, and I'm going to give you some more information so you see like how things kind of progress. So we're going to start with early experimentation. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to be dating myself quite a bit because how many people have ever used a camera with film? Okay, a few people. Has anybody ever made a pinhole camera? No? Okay. All right, well, we're going to talk about all that. So the idea for photography came from the camera obscura, which is pictured here. So the camera obscura was around since like Renaissance times. And you could actually do. I think I have done that, where you kind of block out all the light and it reflects. Yes. I've done that. Okay, good. So when I was in high school a long time ago, I took photography as a class, and I made a pinhole camera out of like an oatmeal container. And if you punch a tiny hole, the light coming in will reflect whatever is out in the world in front of it onto the back of the container. Okay. This is a camera obscura. So this one is very large, like a person can fit in there, but you could make one out of a box or whatever. If you put a hole, light is going to project whatever is outside of it upside down in here. So this is where like the idea of photography came from. And then you can see people developed a system where they could copy the image. So like at this time, there's no way to have an actual photograph. But in this illustration, the guy is using a mirror to reflect the image and then he's tracing it. Okay, so the idea that like light coming into a darkened space will reflect an image is like the foundation of photography. Yeah, light coming into a darkened space and reflecting an image is where photography came from. Now, to use a camera obscura and then actually capture an image, you have to have something in there that is light sensitive or can absorb light. And so there's a lot of like chemical processes that go with this, and I'll talk about some of them, but not really in much detail. Like today, if you were to use, so like when I made that camera out of the oatmeal container 25 years ago, we had to put like photo paper in there, like special paper that absorbs light. And then we had to go through a chemical process to actually develop the image, right? So the next stage is somebody figuring out what kind of material can absorb the light and make an image. And so this French guy was the first one to ever do that. The world's first permanent photograph from nature was taken around 1826. He discovered this light sensitive material called bitumen, and he put it on a metal plate, put it in front of looking out the window of his home to capture the image. And it's reversed, but like you can see, here's an actual photograph of his home. Here is the early photograph, and then here's what it looks like today. Okay. Now, this is how any kind of film camera works, is that like a modern day film camera, there's film in there that can absorb light, and you open the shutter, like when you push the button and it clicks, the shutter opens for a fraction of a second, it lets the light in, it captures the image. But in this time period, you had to leave it open, let the light come in for a long time period to capture the image. So for this one, he had to leave it there for 8 hours exposed to the light to capture the image. This makes it pretty blurry because things change over 8 hours, right? Like clouds go by, the sun changes, and so that makes the image kind of blurry. So early issues with the first part of photography, speed. He had to leave it there exposed for 8 hours. Resolution, it's not very clear. And then permanence. So the problem he had, and the reason that the one on the left is so dark, is because there was no way to stop it from continuing to be exposed to the light. So after the 8 hours, he had the image, but then unless it's in a totally dark room, it's going to continue to catch light. So one of the first really important inventions in photography is a chemical called hypo, and this stops the darkening of the image. So I don't know if you know that, but any kind of film, even today, it can't be, like if you use a film camera, you can't just take out that film in the light. It'll ruin everything. You have to go into a dark room, and they do this, like at a store now, mechanically. But if you wanted to do it yourself, you'd have to go into a dark room, take it out in the dark, and then put it in like different chemicals to make the image develop and then stop the image from continuing to darken. Okay, so our first required image is Still Life in Studio by Daguerre. He invented one of the early ways to capture photographs, which is called a daguerreotype. And so this picture we have is a daguerreotype, and I'm going to show you a short video clip that will explain like what is a daguerreotype and how does it work.
I think it's impossible for us today to imagine what a revelation the first photographs would have been to people, these mirrors with a memory, to record things that looked just like what we saw. People's ideas of time changed completely. For the first time, you would know what your grandparents looked like, even if they died before you were born. To see this process make its place in the lives of ordinary people is, to me, the most exciting thing about it. It changed everything.
In 1814, 1815, you have a man named Nicéphore Niepce. And what he discovered was that asphalt was sensitive to light. He painted the solution on a piece of glass and put an engraving on a piece of paper on top of that. And where the light shined through and exposed that asphalt, it hardened. If you put that piece of glass with the asphalt into a solvent, it will remove the areas that weren't hardened. The earliest photograph we know is on a piece of pewter made by Nicéphore Niepce. It's a view from a window. It's from the 1820s, and this image made by asphalt still exists. So that's the invention of photography. Niepce knows that he's onto something, and he takes Louis Daguerre on as a partner.
Daguerre was well known in Paris in the 1820s, well before the 1839 announcement of the daguerreotype. He was a showman. He ran this 75-foot diorama.
Daguerre himself wants to make images. He understands how a camera obscura works. Niepce didn't have the money. He didn't have the youth. He didn't have the health. He really kickstarted Daguerre. When Niepce died, Daguerre continued his experiments on his own. By 1839, Daguerre has a system that is fully realized. It's perfect. It's a piece of copper coated with silver, and you have to polish it very well to the point where you have a polish that when you turn the plate towards a darkened room, it looks black. And it's fumed with iodine, and when you take it out of the box, it's yellow. That's silver iodide. Plate is then put into a camera obscura, or we would say camera now, but a camera obscura. Given enough time.
Okay, so here's a camera obscura. He put the plate in, which is sensitive to light. So he's going to aim it at what he wants to capture and open the shutter at the front and let the light come in for however long it takes, and then close the shutter, and the image is captured. And then you'll see the process. He has to do some other stuff with it. So just keep watching and I'll go over it again.
It's exposed. When you take it out of the camera in a darkened room, there's nothing to see on the plate. completely invisible, same yellow coating. But when you put it in another box with a little container of mercury and heat the mercury, the fumes of the mercury dance upon the plate. And when you withdraw that from the box, you have an image. You still have to fix the image. And fixing is a strange term. It basically means that you're preventing the plate from changing any more as light strikes the plate. And you place it into a solution that fixes it. It's something that we now all call hypo. Daguerreotype is placed into a special case. It's designed to keep air away from the plate because air is what makes silver tarnish. Daguerre would give the process to the government. The government then would allow anyone in the world to do the daguerreotype, except England. And so if you wanted to make daguerreotypes in England, you had to pay a fee.
This is the Giroux daguerreotype camera. It would be the world's first commercially manufactured and sold cameras. It's the camera, but it's also the system that goes with it that you need to process, sensitize and process the image.
It was essentially an American phenomenon. It was the Americans that embraced it, that used it. It was Americans that were leaving home and striking out further and further west so that people could have something to think about and to reflect on and to remember people by.
So I'll go through that again, but the daguerreotype, you take a very finely polished silver plate. And you put it in the camera. You let light come and create the image. Then you have to develop the image with mercury. And then you have to use hypo to fix the image, which means so that it doesn't continue to get darker and darker. Hypo? H-Y-P-O. Okay, and you saw in the video, daguerreotypes were used a lot for portraits. This was like the first time that people could potentially like have a picture of themselves taken and then have a physical copy of it. So that's why daguerreotypes are so significant. In our image here, Still Life in Studio, he, I think, is trying to show photography as an art form. And that's at the top of your page. Is it art or science? Is a major theme in early photography, because there's like all these chemical processes going. So that's what people are questioning. Like, is this really an art form that takes skill like painting, or is it just like a scientific thing? What does he include here to kind of connect it to earlier art, to make the argument that it is art? What? Yeah, I mean, we have the nude. We have the two little cherubs. So we have stuff that looks very classical, I think, which he probably chose to make the statement that it is art. Well, that's true. I agree. Okay, so daguerreotype compared to like this one, all right, which is not impressive, it gives us a lot more gradation of color, a lot more detail. Like we have a lot of different values of light and dark. I'm sure they did, because the chemicals are like very toxic. Yeah, you can. Yeah. Okay, so downsides here, it only creates one single image. So you can't like make a copy of it. It's what's on the plate is it. And it's a dramatically shortened exposure time. So the exposure time of a daguerreotype is in minutes rather than 8 hours. And so that's what allows us to capture people. So in all those portraits, maybe the person has to sit there still for like, I don't know, like between 5 and 10 minutes, but it's certainly not 8 hours. That's also why a lot of times people are not smiling in these early portraits, because it'd be very hard to sit like this for like 10 minutes and not move, right? So it's much easier to just sit like this and not move. Because if you move, what's going to happen? It's going to end up blurry because it's going to capture like all your little movements on the same image. But they could get different images in it. Yeah. And I don't have an example of that, but yes. And actually, this one gets to that point. Daguerre accidentally took the first ever photograph of a person in 1839. He was pointing his camera out the window on a Paris street, and this man stopped for a shoe shine. And so he was captured because he was there for several minutes. If he had just been like walking by the whole time, he probably wouldn't have been captured because it wouldn't have been long enough to put his image onto the film. But there he is. Okay, more innovations. So eventually negatives were created. And this is what we have today in a film camera. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and then I'll come right back to this one so you can write stuff down. Here's what a modern day negative looks like. So like when I was young, even actually when I was not that young, this is what we did. So you would take the film and then take it like to a photo place, and they would develop your negatives, and then they would print your photos, but they'd also give you this part, the negative, so that if you wanted more copies in the future, you could have more copies made. The negative is just the opposite. So like the light is dark, the dark is light. Okay, and then they flip it when they make the actual photograph. So the first negatives were called a calotype, and that allows you to make multiple copies. That's why that's a big deal. Okay. Here's the same guy who developed that. He's like taking a photograph of photographers. So all those boxes are their cameras. And here it gets even, like you can see it's really advancing, getting even more detailed. To me, these look like they surely could be from the 20th century, but they're actually from 1867. Okay, further development, further innovation is the collodion method. So the collodion method, you put a light sensitive substance called gun cotton onto a glass plate. The advance of this is that it has an even shorter exposure time. So you only have to leave the camera exposed for 3 to 5 minutes. It also creates a much clearer, sharper image. The major disadvantage of this is that you have to develop it immediately or it doesn't work. So again, today, if you use a film camera, the film is in there, and then you have to take it into a dark room to develop it, but you can do that anytime. Like it can be even years later, theoretically. In this method, you have to do that right away. So like the photographer, if they're out somewhere taking photographs, they would have to bring like a dark blanket that they like put over themselves and then take the plate out and then like do all the chemical stuff to make the image. They have to do it right away. So that's a big issue. In somewhere that's dark. That is more so that they can see it better. But they would, to take the plate out of the camera, they'd have to be in a totally dark space. Not in this method. In this method, it has to be while the plate is still, that you put in, is still wet with the chemical. So that's why it's not great. But it made better images. Okay, so this image we have, you can see, is an illustration. It's not a photograph. And it's a lithograph, which is a form of printmaking. And this is called Nadar, raising photography to the height of art. So again, there was that debate. Is this art? Is it technology? And Nadar was already a famous photographer working in Paris. So he was well known. And I'm going to read this. Nadar, one of the most prominent photographers in Paris at the time, was known for capturing the first aerial photographs from the basket of a hot air balloon. Obviously, the difficulties in developing a glass negative under these circumstances must have been considerable. And I'm going to show you some pictures, then I'll come back to this slide. Here on the right is one of his aerial photographs. So he went up in a hot air balloon and captured an image of the city from above, which no one had ever been able to see before. And this is his balloon, which was very famous, which got put on like display and was the tourist attraction. All right, so this is an illustration. It's a satire. It's like poking fun at Nadar. And the title, Nadar raising photography to the height of art. What's like the pun there? How is he raising it? Because he's in a balloon. He's raising it up. So it's like a double meaning. And this illustration was made in response to a court case. So there was a court case in France about whether photography could be classified officially as art. And the case said it is. And this was like a commentary on that. So this artist who made this, he made prints that just like commented on daily life and modern life. Mm-hmm. I think based on like probably taxation and how it could be a fish be a part of official art shows and like all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. It's called a lithograph, which is already written in the identifiers for you. If you want to make a note that a lithograph is print, it's a type of printmaking, you can do that. So that just means, well, what's the advantage of prints? You tell me. Cheaper, make a lot of them. Yeah. So he made these illustrations and then they could be sold, a lot of copies of them. And Nadar, the photographer who he's depicting, was also really well known for portraits of people. And you can see in this portrait like how far photography has come since the first photo I showed you. It looks very detailed, like we would expect a photograph to look. This photograph is actually of Eugene Delacroix, who did Liberty Leading the People, who we learned about. But Nadar said that he sought in his work that instant of understanding that puts you in touch with the model, helps you sum him up, guides you to his habits, his ideas, and characters, and enables you to produce a really convincing and sympathetic likeness, an intimate portrayal. So he really wanted to capture like the real essence of the person through his photography. And then you don't have to write this down, but I just thought it might connect to some stuff that y'all know about. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Matthew Brady, but he was major photographer during the Civil War, which is when photography really took off in the United States. Hi. Chris, you're leaving? So like here he did a portrait of Abraham Lincoln. That's a portrait of Robert E. Lee. He did photographs of battlefields and stuff. So it's around the time photography really took off in the United States. Okay, the next required image we have is called The Horse in Motion by Edward Muybridge. So the realist photographer and scientist Edward Muybridge came to the US from England, where he established a prominent international reputation for his photographs of the western United States. In 1872, the governor of California sought Muybridge's assistance in settling a bet about whether at any time in a stride, all 4 feet of a galloping horse are off the ground. This is something that can't be seen with the naked eye, so people didn't know the answer to this. And so he developed a system of sequential photography as seen in horse galloping. And he proved that racing horses did in fact at times have all 4 feet in midair. This experience was the beginning of Muybridge's photographic studies of the successive stages in human and animal motion, details too quick for the human eye to capture. And I have a video about how he did this, so just watch and we'll talk about it. Oops.
Edward Muybridge was a landscape, urban, and travel photographer. He was commissioned by Leland Stanford, an entrepreneur and horse breeder, to devise ways of using the camera to analyze the movement of horses scientifically. In 1878, Muybridge published his first series of sequence photographs taken at Stanford's Palo Alto farm in California. Muybridge shot many sequences of animals and humans using his innovative motion photography process. He became well known for his work, but the movement portrayed was so new to his audience that not everybody believed his pictures were true. To help demonstrate his photographic findings during his lectures, Muybridge invented the zoopraxiscope. This projected his images in sequence and gave them the illusion of movement. However, to prepare the photographs for projection, Muybridge needed to transfer them to a glass disc. And this was no easy process because the projector had a limitation. If Muybridge used it to project the images onto the screen without treating them first, the image would look squashed up and distorted. Muybridge had to counter this effect by rephotographing them at an angle to make them appear wider, and bending the photographs in the opposite direction to the distortion caused by the circular disc. The rephotographed prints were laid out in a circle to create a paper guide disc. A specialist artist then copied the images painstakingly onto a 16-inch glass disc using paint. The zoopraxiscope discs were a great success, helping Muybridge prove the accuracy of his photography and leading to a contract at the University of Pennsylvania, where he took many thousands of sequence photographs. As time went on, more detail went into the projected images, often with several different sequences on the same disc. This process of combining figures would not have been possible had the original photographs been used, and gave Muybridge great freedom in creating imaginative scenes with many moving figures. For his appearance at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, which showcased many new inventions and popular trends, Muybridge also created new discs, in colour. These were made in a similar way up to a point. But when the photographic montage was complete on paper, the process changed. Instead of copying it directly onto glass, the artist made a paper drawing of the sequence. This was signed by Muybridge, and photographed. A large glass negative was produced, and then a large glass positive, which the artist, Erwin Faber, would enrich with vivid colour, and the finished disc was cut out of the glass sheet, ready for projection. It was the silhouette discs that were used for most of Muybridge's lectures, even though the later discs were more colourful. But with the emergence of cinema, these discs remained almost unknown.
Okay. So here's like other examples. All right, so he created this with multiple cameras, okay? So today, if I wanted to do this, there's like a setting on my iPhone that will take like 20 rapid pictures to capture something. But he had to set up 20 cameras to get this. And like with the horse example, he set up tripwires that as the horse went over them, it would make the camera go off. And that's how he got these images. The reason this was possible is by the time that he's working, the time that so this one we have is 1878. By this time, the exposure time is down to a fraction of a second. So it's more like how we have today, where it's just open, close, and then you get your image, rather than having to let the light come in for a really long time. And then he created this piece of technology called the zoopraxiscope, which is written on your paper as a vocab word. The zoopraxiscope, like, put them together so that it looks like a moving image. So the illusion of motion in Muybridge's photographic exhibits was the result of a physical fact of human eyesight called the persistence of vision. Stated simply, it means that the brain retains whatever the eye sees for a fraction of a second after the eye stops seeing it. Thus, viewers saw a rapid succession of different images merging one into the next, producing the illusion of continuous change. And that's still how like movies that are made on film work, is that our eye like puts it together. Has anybody ever made, when they were younger, like a little flip book where you make it look like it's moving? So it's the same idea. Like our brain will put the images together to make it look like it's movement. Okay, and then our very last one is called the steerage, which is a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz. So steerage refers to people in the bottom of a ship. So if you've ever seen like the movie Titanic or anything, the people are separated by social class on the ship, and we see that in this photograph here. So Stieglitz was a well-known photographer in New York. And he was very devoted to making photography a serious art form, like where people take it seriously as a form of artistic expression, just like they do painting and sculpture. So I'm going to show you just a short video about, it's like quoting him, what he said about making this.
For 5 years, from 1902 to 1907, Stieglitz rarely used his camera, promoting other photographers at the sacrifice of his own work. Now a shipboard experience would stir him to create one of his most memorable images.
In June 1907, my wife, our daughter Kitty, and I sailed for Europe. My wife insisted on going on a large ship, fashionable at the time. It was impossible to escape the nouveau riche. Ye gods. By the third day out, I could stand it no longer. I had to get away. I walked as far forward as possible. Coming to the end of the deck, I stood alone, looking down. There were men, women, and children on the lower levels of the steerage. The scene fascinated me. A round straw hat, the funnel leaning left, the stairway leaning right. White suspenders crossed on the back of a man below. A mast that cut into the sky, completing a triangle. I saw shapes related to one another, a picture of shapes, and underlying it, a new vision that held me. I raced to the main stairway of the steamer, chased down into my cabin, picked up my Graflex, raced back again, worrying whether or not the man with the straw hat had shifted his position. If he had, the picture I saw would no longer exist. The man with the straw hat had not stirred an inch. The man in the crossed suspenders, he too stood where he had been talking. No one had moved. I had only one plate holder with one unexposed plate. I released the shutter, my heart thumping. If I had captured what I wanted, it would be a picture based on related shapes and deepest human feeling. A step in my own evolution.
Okay. So when we look at this today, I think it's easy to think that it's like some kind of like political statement or something about the social classes. It's not for him. Like you heard in the video, he's concerned with like the light, the shape, the composition. But this is during the time period when like thousands of immigrants are coming across the Atlantic to the US. So like those are who the people are at the bottom here, the lower class people. Those are, yes. And so he's not attempting to directly address that in this photograph. It's more just about the composition, the shape, the form. And this is considered like the first modernist photograph. Okay, now I'm going to wrap up, but just something to think about how art is changing and changes as a result of photography. So we have been learning the artworks that are kind of in that back corner of the room. You can see Liberty Leading the People and the Grande Odalisque and some other ones we've done recently. So now that we have photography starting in that time period, if you want something that looks totally naturalistic, you can take a photograph. So art starts to really change. Okay, so the steerage that we just looked at is right over there above the blue poster. You see it? Look at the blue poster on the chalkboard. Right above that is the steerage. And then look at the art that's around that same time period. It definitely looks very different than what we've been studying. So I think the advent of photography really caused art to change as well. And we're going to learn more about that. Mm-hmm.